I've said many times, Molinism is a man-made philosophy, pretending to exist in biblical theology.
Folks, that's one of my biggest problems, is when Christian theology is determined by philosophy and not by the exegesis of God's divine word.
Sometimes Molinists get accused of not deriving Molinism from Scripture, but instead getting it from philosophy. And Molina himself, it was about the Scripture to him, right? Molina didn't seem to want to do this to come up with some new philosophical system. Molina, it seemed to me from the content I've seen and read from you, is that Molina had all these verses and he was trying to make sense of how they cohered.
Correct.
So, correct. Yeah.
And then using philosophy and bringing that to bear. So I'm a firm believer, and Molina would have been as well, that all truth is God's truth. That we don't pit various streams of truth against each other. That to me seems ridiculous. Rather, I tend to think that having a good knowledge of philosophy is really imperative to having a really good knowledge of theology. So, yeah, you're quite correct that Molina saw these various biblical texts. He did not think that all of them were being dealt with appropriately by the Protestant reformers. That's not true of all of them, but Luther and Calvin. And that therefore, he said, we've got these texts. We can't say that, well, let's use this type of text to say, well, the other text really doesn't mean what it looks like it means. You've got to let Scripture stand on its own merits. And that's something that I've appreciated about Molinism from the very start, that I don't have to pit Scripture against Scripture, that I can believe in the totality of what Scripture says. And then using the tools of philosophy, I think of philosophy as the handmaiden to theology, then you can begin to make sense of this. So there's nothing wrong with starting with Scripture to see what the issue is, and then bringing the resources of philosophy to bear upon it. I think that that's quite glorifying to God, and part of what Jesus meant when he told us to love God with all of our minds.
See, Molinism is about philosophy. It's not about Scripture. So anyway, with that being said, I want to play a clip real quick of some of these exact criticisms. That way, people don't watch this and go, who are they attacking? They're just attacking straw man up there. A lot of these people are people that I actually really like, and I followed their work for years, and I think, hey, great apologists, got some great material, a few of these different people, right? So I don't want to say that any of these people are like, oh, they're beyond being saved or anything like that, right? I just want to say that, like, let's take their critiques, and I'll let you respond to this as well.
God did the best he could. Given the cards he was dealt, he didn't use that terminology here, but that's what he's saying. It's not feasible. How is that not exactly what he said earlier about the card dealer? The circumstances available to God.
Am I right? I honestly do not believe that the whole assertion that God would know what any free creature would do in any possible circumstance is a meaningful statement.
I believe as an omnipotent being that God does have that power. Omnipotence means the ability to do anything that is logically possible. It is logically possible for creatures to have libertarian free will. There's no logical contradiction in it. Then God, by definition, is able to do it. So libertarian freedom is possible regardless of Molinism. For goodness sake, Arminians believe in libertarian freedom. Open theists believe in libertarian freedom. Some atheists probably believe in libertarian freedom, although they might have a hard time explaining it or justifying it based on materialism, if they happen to be materialists. And Dr. White seems to just view this through the lenses of Calvinism and not realize that he's confusing two distinct types of counterfactuals. He's confusing counterfactuals of determinism, whose truth values God determines, and there are counterfactuals of determinism. So the counterfactual that if God were to create such and such a world, he would send Christ in that world. That's a counterfactual of determinism. God determines that. God determines the truth value. But that confuses it with counterfactuals of indeterminacy, whose truth values no one determines by definition because they're indeterminate. Well, that's not the counterfactual that I'm thinking that statement expresses. But if that's the kind of world God has chosen to create, then I would agree with Dr. White that God clearly determines its truth value. However, I think an omniscient God has chosen to create a world containing counterfactuals of indeterminacy. So I think Jesus is instead expressing the statement, if the miracles were performed in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, and I did not determine their response, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes.
Right.
This statement has a truth value, and Dr. White believes God does not know it. And he tries to justify God's not knowing it based on the grounding objection. Now, as I've already explained, I think that I've made an argument that the grounding objection does not stand because these counterfactuals of indeterminacy are logical contraries, and one of the other of them have to be true because the circumstances are fully specified. So it's amazing to me that Dr. White, while really claiming, oh, I'm just going on Scripture, he raises the grounding objection, which is purely out of philosophy.
Just philosophy, right?
That's not out of Scripture. How can you justify the grounding objection by virtue of Scripture? Is he really going to say that God is bound to what the grounding objection will permit God to know?
Yeah, I found that to be interesting that in one setting, he says, this is just, it's not from Scripture, it's not exegetical, it's philosophy. And then his argument against it was the philosophical grounding objection.
Yes.
And so I understand what you're saying, and I think that's right, that even if the grounding objection worked as a philosophical argument, that which we don't grant, we're not going to concede that.
Right.
But let's just say if it were the case that we can't justify or show that God, could possibly have this this knowledge of creatures, free creatures, it still wouldn't follow that the Scripture teaches that. The Scripture doesn't say anything about that.
Right.
I don't believe that God could have middle knowledge of exactly what I would order, because I did change it. As predictable as I am, and some of you aren't anywhere near as predictable as I am. So I question this first assertion. I don't believe that middle knowledge is found.
White says, and I don't think God could have this knowledge of what I would do because as predictable as I am, I choose different sometimes. I think, isn't that just kind of a misunderstanding of what we mean? Right? Because...
Well, it really is exactly what I was accusing White of before. Here he just flatly admits that there is knowledge out there and it has a truth value. Logically, it has to have a truth value before God's creative decree. Somehow on his view, God is omniscient, and yet God doesn't know it. And to me, that is just incredible. I don't know how he can consistently hold that God is omniscient on that view.
Yeah, that's so interesting that we get accused from a lot of these people of, you're limiting God.
It seems to me that God's will is limited to finding a world that free creatures allow him to create to accomplish his purpose.
But then they'll turn around and say,
Not at all.
I don't think God could know what we could would do.
Exactly.
And I'm like, we're limiting God, but you don't think that he could possibly know what we would do if he's the one that created us. And
statements whose truth values are logically necessary, namely necessary truths, and statements that logically necessarily have a truth value, but it is not logically necessary which truth value they have. Those would be contingent truths. And so in God's natural knowledge, God does know all necessary truths. That is, all statements whose truth values are logically necessary. But counterfactuals of indeterminacy, it is logically necessary that they have a truth value. I've argued that already today, but it's not logically necessary which truth value they have.
So your biggest criticism of Molinism is you don't think it reflects the teaching of Scripture, the clear teaching of Scripture, and philosophically, you think the grounding objection is kind of a nail in the coffin of the concept in general.
Until someone can explain how you can know how you can know what a free creature would do before God decrees the universe in which he exists, his own character, his own capacities, what his physical nature is going to be, what his mental nature is going to be, what his giftings. I'm sorry, it makes human volition something that is utterly separated from the human being itself.
Look, God's got to play with the cards he's been dealt by middle knowledge. To which I go, then we need to be worshiping the card dealer, because the card dealer is superior to God, because the card dealer sovereignly determined what free creatures would do in any given circumstance. Either that, you have to say, well, nobody did that, which means now the very form of any possible world is determined by some it's fate. It's just fate. Determine these things. This is the grounding objection. It's been the objection. Francis Turretin made this the essence of his argument in his Institutes of Eclectic Theology. And I believe it's an absolutely valid, unquestionable fatality to the Molinistic.
Fatality.
The grounding objection first, I guess. I love the way that you handle the grounding objection because, before really reading much of your work, I had heard a few explanations from Molinists, but you really have this comprehensive, what you call a highway of answers, which is you can get off here. First, the first stop is what you said earlier, that, well, first of all, this isn't even a biblical argument. It's a philosophical argument, right? And the second stop is something like, even if we don't know how it works, that doesn't mean that we can't still believe it, right?
Right.
And so why don't you go from there? Tell us, let's move down the stops real quick.
Yeah. Well, first thing I would say is that oftentimes people use the phrase grounding objection, and what they mean by it is, I don't understand how God could know such and such. That's not the way the grounding objection is used in philosophical literature. Grounding objection there means that there does not exist anything in reality by virtue of which some proposition is true. So a grounding objector would say that because there's sort of nothing there before God to be known, they would think that there's nothing there before God to be known, and that's how they would try to remedy God's omniscience by saying God just knows what's logically knowable, and it's not logically knowable. So the grounding objector is saying that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are logically unknowable. So how would I try to diffuse the grounding objection? Well, there are several exits that you can take. First of all, the grounding objection presupposes a particular version of the correspondence theory of truth, known as truth-maker theory. Truth-maker theory is only advocated by a minority of philosophers. So, as I said before, the grounding objection alleges that there is no metaphysical ground, aka the truth-maker, on which any proposition about a contingent choice can be true logically prior to its occurrence. So, concerning propositions about contingent choices logically prior to their occurrence, these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, the grounding objector William Hasker has asked, who or what is it, if anything, that brings it about that these propositions are true? So that's his way of stating the grounding objection. But I would ask, which is more obvious, truth-maker theory or the truth of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? Plantinga, I think, is quite right when he says it seems to him much clearer that some counterfactuals of freedom are at least possibly true than that truth-maker theory is valid. So Molinists assert that even human beings with their finite intelligence and insight can foreknow some contingent choices of other human beings. So if I can foreknow some contingent choices, why can't God, with his infinite intelligence and insight, foreknow all contingent choices of possible individuals? Second way you can get off the highway, the grounding objection not only presupposes truth-maker theory, but it assumes an extreme version of this theory known as truth-maker maximalism. Truth-maker maximalism says that every truth must have a truth-maker. Now, interestingly, most truth-maker theorists hold that only some truths need truth-makers, and they exempt propositions like counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So you could say, well, why be a truth-maker maximalist? And if you don't find truth-maker maximalism valid, or if you exempt counterfactuals of creaturely freedom from needing a truth-maker, grounding objection doesn't hold. Third, the grounding objection requires that truth-makers be concrete objects that cause things to be true. But truth-maker theory in general, and even truth-maker maximalism, doesn't usually define a truth-maker in that way. Truth-makers are usually construed to be things like facts or states of affairs, and those are abstract entities. More often than not, they're the facts stated as the truth conditions of a proposition, what's known as disquotation. So what makes the statement, quote, snow is white, true, is the fact that snow is white, or the state of affairs of snow's being white. And abstract entities, as we said before, don't stand in causal relationships. So I would say if counterfactuals of creaturely freedom require truth makers, why can't these truth makers be abstract objects? Namely, the facts revealed by the disquotation principle. So why can't what makes the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, if I were rich, then I would buy a yellow Lamborghini, true, be the fact that if I were rich, then I would buy a yellow Lamborghini, or the state of affairs of my being rich and buying a yellow Lamborghini? I don't see why not. And then I think the last thing that needs to be said is that someone could say, well, if there are these abstract objects out there, then these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom exist independently of God and so violate God's aseity.
Middle knowledge. And remember, middle knowledge is not the result of his decree. All the questions I'm going to be asking then is, it seems to me, God's options were determined by something outside of God.
However, Molina was a divine conceptualist. I am as well. And Molina identified these abstract objects as among the contents of God's mind. So Molina proposed the doctrine of supercomprehension, and this would be God's unlimited intellectual capacity to perceive infinitely within God's own mind the individual essence for every possible thing he could create. And these individual essences don't exist independently of God. They don't exist outside of God.
It seems to me, God's options were determined by something outside of God.
They only exist as designs within the mind of God. And then the ground, the ultimate ground of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom is God himself, is God's knowledge by virtue of God's intelligence, God's insight, God's intuition, God's beliefs about what these free creatures would do if he were to create them in such and such circumstances.
Okay, so let me just summarize all of that real quick before we move on to the next exit that we can get off, right? Because so what you're saying here, and just for myself and the audience, so we can put the scholarly into a more condensed version. So what you're saying is that the truth maker, this grounding objection is based on a thing called the truth maker theory.
Yes.
Right? And it's saying that
if truth maker theory is false, then there is no grounding objection.
So first of all, you can just reject truth maker theory as being the case. And there is reasons to be skeptical of it.
Most philosophers are.
Right. The second point is that even if you say truth maker theory is the case, right? Yeah. This is appropriate. The majority of people who accept it aren't even maximalist, meaning they don't think that everything needs a truth maker.
Correct.
Instead, the interesting thing is, a lot of those things that they think don't need truth makers are counterfactual statements.
Yes.
So exactly what we're talking about here. And so that is very interesting. Then you're saying that and they try to say that these need to be concrete objects that cause something to be true. When the fact is that according to Plantinga, in this disquotation principle, right, it's basically that what makes it true is the fact if you take away the quotation marks. So my wife would choose mint chocolate ice cream over chocolate if she were in an ice cream parlor with those two options. Now, if I take away the quotations and the fact that she would actually do that is what makes it true without some type of concrete object making it true.
Correct.
And then the last part of
and
that
that's
is...
why I'll just jump in
go
and
ahead.
say the making. That's why when people say truth making and makes it true, you have to give a little asterisk beside making, because making sounds like a causal relationship. And that's not the way any truth maker, maximalist or otherwise, understands truth makers. They just understand it as that in virtue of which something is true, but not as a causal relationship.
Right, like a justifier, but it doesn't have to necessarily be
Correct.
making it in that sense. Yeah.
Right,
and so
right.
the last part is abstract objects. And you're going to say that it doesn't need to be a concrete object. It can be an abstract object. And in fact, Molina himself had this. He was a divine conceptualist, which you are as well. And he basically says that amongst the the components. This is a component amongst God's in God's mind, or something like that.
Yeah,
Would you say?
Yeah.
So these abstract objects that are the truth maker of this the case here are just abstract objects in the mind of God. And so that the whole point is that this is a bunch of ways off of the grounding objection highway.
Yes.
And so so are there more, or do we stop there?
I think we can stop there. I'm working on a few more that are going to come out in the book in 2023, but we'll stop there.
Sure, let's stop there. And I guess what we'll do is, are you pressed for time right now? How much?
I probably have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, so I guess what we can do is give me 2 minutes, explain the problem of evil. I'm just kidding.